Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the Friday Night Blender Hangouts. My name is Brandon Hicks, and I am your host. So tonight we're going to get started and get back to the sculpture that we've been working on, which is a hand-carved pipe in Blender. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention that if you haven't checked out theorangeguild.com, make sure you do so. I'm going to mention this again towards the end of the stream when we have a few more people on, hopefully. But there's a lot of cool things coming your way. I've started adding some private live streams just for the guild that are in a new course, and I'll talk about that a little later on. But for right now, welcome to the stream. Hope you guys are doing well this evening. We're going to spend the next couple of hours looking at sculpture in Blender, doing some concept sculpting, and trying to get something ready for the 3D illustration for June. And if you have any questions or you just want to talk, I'm listening in the chats. Whether you're on YouTube, Twitch, or Picarto, I'm live on all three. So just let me know what you're thinking about and if you have any questions as we go. Okay, let me kind of switch my screen over here. And let's take a look at that reference. Okay, so you can see most of the ship here. I want to try to keep the chat window up. Maybe I'll do a window split. See if it'll let me do that. Maybe I can just minimize. There we go. Okay, so now that we've got this full screen and we can see everything, let's jump in and take a look at our project. So if at any time during the stream you guys can't see what I'm working on or the wrong camera showing or something like that, just let me know and I'll be sure to switch that over. So what I thought I would do is just kind of update you a little bit about what I did today. You can see I did a little bit more work than we were doing last night. Tried to clean some of these edges up and got in here and kind of tightened up some of these creases. And I've got varying levels of density going on right now in the mesh. So if I show you the wireframe, you can see some areas are sort of at a medium resolution. Some areas I've added quite a bit more polys so that we can get more details in there. And that's really the benefit of using dynamic topology, is that you don't have to have the entire mesh be one really dense resolution. You can just kind of pick and choose where you want to add those polys. So I'm being selective there. Started trying to get all the major forms in place as far as these, bulks, holes, shapes, bulkheads, like this one right here and all that. And we need to start kind of unifying the whole thing together. So the sphere has been kind of placed in a better spot. It's been scaled down a little bit so that it can accommodate things. And hopefully tonight, what I can do is get it up to a pretty decent level before we end this. So for the first hour, I'm actually going to start working on modeling, and then we can jump back into sculpting towards the second hour and see if we can kind of get this in a better place. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of work on this little, again, I don't know what to call this. It's like a fin or a little, it basically controls the steering for the up and down motion of the sub. And so it's not a rudder, but whatever that would be called. So I just want to block this in and kind of get it in place. We'll probably be able to get it looking pretty decent pretty quickly. So I just want to think about how we approach this. Do we need to do any mirroring? It's asymmetrical, so I don't think we need to worry about that at all. So I'm just going to move this over here and kind of get going. Okay, so let's bring this down so that it kind of lines up with the little hole that we created here. And now we can just kind of start shaping our plane. And so, Lauren, I know we were going to start working on beginner stuff next week, but if you want to know anything about keyboard shortcuts or anything that I'm working on as I'm doing this, I'm probably not going to call them all out. What I can do is turn on my screencast keys, and I know that's covered up right now. So I need to move this over a little bit. So hopefully you should be able to see this in the middle of my screen here. And this will tell you kind of what tools I'm using and the keyboard shortcuts that I'm hitting as I go. Okay, so we'll pull this out towards the middle, and I just kind of want to get a basic shape in place for how this needs to look. So one of the things we might do is want to line this up and snap it over to that. We can choose vertex right down here for snapping, and hold Control, and that will snap that to that vertice. Lorian says she's going to pester me relentlessly. That's fine. Okay, so we're running into a situation here where, because we're only getting a side view to look at, we're having to make some creative decisions here for how this needs to be shaped. So I know this basically indicates that there's sort of a vertical line running down the middle of this. It's sort of a wedge triangular shape, if you can think about that, heading towards the hull of the ship and then kind of flattens off back there. But since we don't have any depth information, we just have to kind of make this up as we go. So need to just kind of decide what we want to do here for that. So maybe something kind of like that. If we want it to be a little bit more flat, we can pull this out towards the side. And actually, it needs to at least come out far enough that from this view, it looks the same as in the concept art. So if we're using this area as a sort of guide for how far over this goes from a distance point of view, you know, we know how far it is from the beginning of this curve to the top of where this sort of radius is. So we can use that as the same basic distance from here to where this starts, and then drop a vertical line straight down from there. And that tells us how far over to go for the left side of this little fin here. So if we look at our mesh, now it's not going to be exact, but we can estimate that, say we want to line this up fairly close to about here. So maybe in our version, these sort of line up a little bit more on top of each other. And then as far as the right side goes, it needs to be sort of like a 2 times wider than the left side. So this is the center of our fin. So we need 2 of these about out to there maybe. Okay. So we have to remember these 2 points on the concept art are at the widest points. And those are either directly sitting on the hull, or maybe it forks back in. So we have sort of a diamond shape happening. So again, it's up to us to decide how that needs to look. But we do know that depth-wise, these probably need to line up to about the same distance. And I'm just going to go ahead and kind of re-topologize as we go, since it's getting a little messy. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm not sure how that would look. We can look up some reference and see from a top perspective what that needs to look like. So let me pull this up on Pinterest, type in airfoil. Yeah, so from top to bottom, we have that sort of mapped out in the concept art, but we need more of that shape here. And this one looks like it just kind of comes to a point and is fairly symmetrical. And I want mine to be a little bit more slanted towards one direction. So the other question is, do we want it to kind of slant backwards like this is? That might be a little bit interesting. And also, sort of on a practical level, if we're making this for a pipe and someone's holding this, if we make it come out too far, they're going to snap it off at some point. It also changes how the pipe can sit on like a flat surface on our desk in the 3D illustration. So if there's a fin on both sides, and there may not be, but if there is, that means it can only roll over so far to one direction. So all of these little practical things need to be kind of weighed, and you know, if there's a good reason not to do something or to spend the time doing it, we need to think that through. Okay. So all that really matters is the furthest out point. So over here it would be this one, over here it would be this one, and everything else can kind of get shifted around. So what I know I'm going to be doing is adding a subdivision surface modifier. So let's add one of those. I'm going to give it a couple of subdivisions to get started. And so now we can sort of think of this outer mesh as a cage for how it influences all these other shapes underneath. And in wireframe view, you can see it's basically just subdividing these two basic quads a couple of times. So we're getting exponentially more squares, and then it's also smoothing it at the same time. So think of these 3 points as a curve for control points, and it curves around based on these 3 points. And so this sort of manipulates how this bends, and it does that for every single point. So subsurf is a really handy modifier because with only a few points around a mesh, you can start really dialing in and controlling how something needs to look. So I'm gonna look and see if there's anything else reference-wise that will help us shape how this looks. There's so many different variations of how these can be shaped. So it's good news for us because we're not experts. And so we're gonna try to get as close as we can. So I do know that I want it to be sort of curved towards the outside, but I want it to be flatter towards the inside. So to create that effect, what we need to do is add another subdivision, and we'll loop cut to add that in, and then we're gonna slide this down and bunch those vertices up really close together. And that's gonna create 2 points on both ends that are tightening the corner of this curve, and that will create sort of a more desired effect there. And so if we want to shape these a little better, we can pull these back. We have to kind of overcompensate to get certain effects depending on what we're trying to do here. So one of the other things we could do is loop cut the other direction. So we could loop cut over here if we want to accentuate this corner on the outside, and it's subtle right here, but it's there. And then you can cross cut this way and do the same thing. So the more you bunch these rows of vertices up against each other, the more sharp your corners are going to get. And that's kind of the secret of modeling this way and controlling things, is anytime you want to crease in the mesh, you bunch a bunch of vertices up together in rows and columns. And that helps define how things are supposed to look. It can also get very messy and hairy to play with if you're not careful in how you sort of mess with things. Okay, so I know that I'm not happy with the resolution right here because there's only 1 point and 2 polys that are defining this curve. And so one of the things we could do is subdivide and add a couple of vertical cuts here. But what we also might do is just add a couple of other points to bring this corner out. So to do that, I'm going to use Alt-D, and I'm going to lean towards the right or the left side of this point to tell Blender which direction I want to go with this. So Alt-D will duplicate this vertice, and it will keep it connected to that other edge. So we can do this once over here, and then we'll select this one again, and then we'll link it over here with this mouse, Alt-T, and now since we were over here, it's gonna follow and connect this way. So Lorian asks, did I say loop cut? And yes, I did. So loop cutting is a way to cut a row or a column of vertices and edges through a polygon. So if we have a plane, and this has our subsurf modifier applied because I'm still in the same object here. If I loop cut with Control R, it's going to give me this little magenta indicator for which direction I want to go. So if I just hover my mouse over one of these edges, it's going to start indicating how it's going to cut this. Left click will accept that cut. And then any time I accept a cut, it's going to ask me now where do I want to place that loop cut. And so I can just slide here. Or again, we talked about last night, you can actually type in numbers to get an accurate distance or rotation value for degrees in Blender. So if you look down at the bottom left-hand corner, you probably can't see it because my webcam is in the way for the other screen. So let me switch that up real fast. We'll switch off that. Okay, so now you should be able to see down here towards the lower left part of the screen. So I'm gonna undo this and then show you again. So Control R, loop cut, pick a direction, left click to accept. Now we're still in that operation for loop cut. This is the second part of it. And now you can see it says edge slide and those numbers are changing as I move around with my mouse. So if I type in a number like 0.5, it's gonna lock that position so where it sees that on the shape. I can backspace to delete what I just wrote. I can write 1.0. Looks like that's going to go all the way to the left side. So it seems to reason that negative 1.0 would go all the way to the right side. And that means 0 would be right in the middle. So if I want to go 25% this way, I would type in 0.5. So that's kind of how it works. Or if you don't want to do that, you can loop cut, and when it starts sliding, you can just hit escape and it will cancel the second half of the operation. And now you're free to move this however you want. So there's a lot of options, and one thing to be aware of too is as you start getting in here and cutting, you'll see there's another option on the right side past the numbers that say even, and then it says off, and then it says alt or clamp on. And so if you see how the E is in parentheses, so that means if I hit E on the keyboard, that's going to switch that on. And in this case, it's basically saying that it's going to even out the distance for how it's cutting on both sides. So we would have to get more into how that works, but you can turn that on and off, and then alt will also kind of clamp how this works as well. So again, almost every operator has options like that, and you just kind of have to pay attention to how they work. And if you're not sure, you can always check out the Blender manual, and you can also ask me, and sometimes I will know, but I don't know everything. So, all right, so let's get back to where we're at. All right, so kind of like the idea of it kind of having a little bit of a corner here. This one I don't think is going to be as necessary. In fact, I don't really like adding that corner right there. Maybe something a little bit more like that. Okay. And I definitely need more points here. So we can either add 2 vertical cuts here to give me vertices on the left and the right side, or I can cut across, or I can try to cut across. And in this case, it's not going to let me because it doesn't understand how to go through this section and then this section and then this section. So it would have to kind of fork too far, and it's not smart enough to know how to do that. So if we wanted to do that, another option is to use a knife tool. So if we hit K on the keyboard, this is another operator, and we can left click on an edge to start a cut through some shapes. And anytime you see a green intersection, that's an opportunity to add another vertice to cut through your quads or your polygons. So if we wanted to create our own path, we can basically do something like this. And I'm just left clicking to get all the way through to the other side. And then when I'm done, to accept this, I just have to hit enter, and that'll create a custom cut for us. And all of these are also found over here in your tool palette. So mesh tools, all the sliding operations that I've been using, extrude, subdivide, knife is right there, the one we just used, and loop cut right there. So all of those are just basic tools that are in Blender right there. So anyways, that's one option. Right now, that's not really going to help us, so I'm not going to do that. But basically, if we start doing what we did up here and adding more points, we no longer have a quad. So this is called an n-gon, and that's any polygon that has more than 4 sides. It's called an n-gon, and those are typically not good when you're working in Blender, but especially when you're working with subdivision surface modifiers. It makes things a lot more unpredictable and can cause pinching and all sorts of weird stuff. So you don't really want to do that. So we're going to go ahead and just add some vertical cuts here. So I'm going to use a knife again. I'll left click on this top edge, and if I want to cut through automatically, I can just do this and do it all in one go. Okay, just like that. And now what I want to do is kind of shape this a little bit more so it's got that rounded out shape. I'm going to bring these a little further apart so it's not such a tight shape there on that corner. And sometimes if you need to kind of see how this is looking, you can just jump out of edit mode, zoom out, and see how kind of smooth it is. Another option is to enable this on your subsurf modifier, and then it'll kind of show you in edit mode how this stuff is bending into curves. So left clicking that will turn your straight edges into curved edges. And you can actually toggle pretty much any of these options. So this actually turns off the subsurf preview. This turns off all the subsurf altogether. So if I'm in object mode and I turn that off, it's basically back to regular polygons. And then this toggles whether or not it renders. So if all of your modifiers are still live and you don't want to render them out, you can just toggle, leave all this other stuff on, and then just turn off this little render button, and it won't show up in the render. So let me know if I'm kind of boring you guys with too much basic stuff. I know we have one person in that probably appreciates it, but I don't want to just dominate the whole thing with basic stuff right now. And we kind of need to speed up a little bit. Okay, so one thing I'm checking right now is to make sure we don't have any n-gons. And looking around, we should be good. Okay, so now we can kind of start working on shaping in the other axis. So we've just been working on the top view. And now we need to start pulling these down to the side so that we have a bit better shape. So I'm going to select all these points here. We'll just move them slightly down in the Z axis. And then I want to get rid of these. Move these down again so we get that sort of curved top shape. And then we've got one more row down here that we want to make sure we kind of smooth out. So deselect those last two, and since we've sort of kept up with the same number of vertices on both sides, this has been pretty easy to manage. And there we go. And now all we need is to kind of get this crease down the middle. So again, the best way to do that with a subsurf modifier is to add another row of vertices. So we could loop cut and bunch two up like this. And that should create a crease that you can kind of see there. I'm going to turn off the matte cap It's a little easier to see what that's doing. So you can kind of see that line. Another way to do this would be to grab this row of edges and bevel it. So we can hit Control B, and that will start beveling an edge. And it's a better example of this would be if we had like a cube. So you can see what bevel actually does. It's not like subdivide. Bevel actually rounds off like a corner. So Control B, and it will start beveling. And as you are moving this around with your mouse, if you use your middle scroll wheel, you can actually add and remove sections of the bevel. And you'll see all the information down at the bottom that's telling you all the settings for this tool, and there's a ton of them. So segments is the one we're messing with right now. So you can see those numbers going up and down. And then all you have to do is left click to accept or escape to undo that. And that's how you kind of round off corners. So in our case, the subdiv modifier is doing a lot of that for us, but we want to crease this. So we can subdivide, we'll add one more segment. So there's 2 segments total to create this line here. And then it's kind of faint. We can't really see it that well. So we're going to take this middle edge and we're just going to move it up very slightly. So not much at all, but that's enough to really kind of make it start standing out. One of the other things is you can start seeing how blocky this is, and that's showing all of our polygons added from this subsurf modifier. And so we want to get rid of that. We want to smooth out the way the light reflects on this in our preview. And so the way we do that is we switch between flat or smooth shading right here in our tools palette. So flat is the default, and smooth will again take everything that's kind of close to being on the same degree of flatness and try to round it off so that you're only keeping the edges that are supposed to be sharp. And in our case, since we bunched up those edges right in the middle, it's actually adding tons of edges from our if we switch into wireframe mode, you can see what I'm saying. It's showing a lot more subdivisions in there, which is in effect creating what we see here. Okay, so I think I'm happy with how this is looking. It's getting a little pointy, and that's because, again, we added those 2 rows, so we need to actually smooth all of these out and kind of so it averages the distance between all of these. And the more we sort of evenly space these, we can even use Loop Tools is a free add-on that's in Blender if you enable that in your preferences. And if you hit space, it'll evenly space these out. And so it's really helpful with the subdiv modifier to accurately even that out. And what that's going to do is simultaneously not create a really sharp corner right here. So it's going to prevent that. And the other effect that it has is that as we move these 2 or 3 edges that are bunched up together in the middle further away from each other towards the tip, it's going to fade out that line that's running down the middle. So you can see how that just kind of blends into the rest of the little wing we have here. So this is my preferred choice of getting really accurate hard surface models done, because I feel like it's faster than sculpting, at least in Blender it is for me. And this is kind of how I came up. I learned the subsurf modeling workflow. Okay, so we can select everything on the outside now, and I want to take this entire shape and I'm going to extrude it down so we have some thickness to this. And notice I'm not grabbing everything right now because I just want to work on the edges. So I'm going to hit E to extrude. That's going to let me start pulling these away from those original edges. And I want to constrain this to the Z axis. So I'll hit Z. That'll lock in my vertical movement. And then I can accept that. I'm going to scale this in a little bit. And then once again, we want to bevel this outside edge. So I'm going to speed up and do a little bit less commentary until somebody has a question. That way we can kind of get through this a little faster. So otherwise, we will spend all night modeling this one little fin. Okay. So there's options for how to complete the bottom. We can we could have extruded this entire object by selecting everything and extruding that down. That would have done an automatic bottom for us. But in this case, we may want to kind of play with how many polys we have to finish this out. So we can start by joining that up, which is a pretty safe bet that we're going to need that. And then what I'm doing is just loop cutting one vertex in the middle of that edge and then sliding down by hitting G twice. F to create a face with our F2 modifier or add-on turned on. And this is kind of how I fill things in manually. Okay. So here's an example of kind of where we get some custom options for how to fill this in that might save us some space. Since that's on the bottom, we don't really care as much how it looks because we're not really ever going to see that. And then we can just copy the same exact flow down here. So just look for 4 points that you can turn into a square, and that's kind of the secret to not losing track of anything. And there you go. Get that little fin in place now. One of the other things we could do is also kind of slide all of these edges out a little further as it gets closer to the hole here. So we'll try to get those at about the same distance from left to right. And again, we're going to run into a situation where that's going to create sort of a tapering effect of the width of our crease here. It's getting a little wider towards the end. And if we're not happy with the way that's tapering off, we can always bring this back. So still tapering, but not as far back, so a little further up. Okay, so let's change the height here, make sure these are all kind of on the same level here. And you'll be able to feel just by the shading on your objects if they're off in terms of the lighting and everything that's happening. So, all right. Let's play a little bit with placement here. So you can see we can get a nice little curvature there if we want that. Remember, we're going to be rotating this First thing I want to do is shift the pivot so that it's sort of in the center of this object right here. So I'm going to pick a point back here and then Shift S to snap the cursor to whatever I have selected, which in this case is that vertice. And then if I use a really long keyboard shortcut, Control Alt Shift C, I can set the origin to the 3D cursor, but I have to be in object mode to do that. So now when I rotate using the origin for the median point down here, it'll rotate around that center. And that center is that little orange dot that you see right there. So now even if I move the 3D cursor around, the orange dot stays. You can kind of think of this as like the center of mass, but you can freely move this around wherever you want in the mesh and it won't really have any effect. But this is handy for animation because now we could, you know, rotate around the correct axis like this. So that's one method of getting the fin in place. And of course we can kind of tweak this to our heart's content. Feeling a little bit better there. So we're kind of more evenly spacing the sides of these vertices the same skip distance apart, and that's helping maintain a really smooth curve all the way down towards the back. Okay. So I'm not super happy with the thickness right now. So let's grab all of these faces. Let's pull this down a little more. Has to feel like it's the right scale for the ship here. I'm also noticing that we don't necessarily want both sides to kind of curve down the same way. It's also rotating, or sorry, it's modeled straight out to the side. So this would probably be tilted a little bit down. At least in my case, that's kind of what I would do to soften the look a little bit. All right, so I'm gonna play with, if you look down the side, you can really see how bumpy this thing is. So I'm gonna play with the height here to line this up a little bit better. Grab all of this, pull this up. Okay, so now we have a really strong, smooth curve running down the side, and same issue over here. We kind of want to strengthen the curve. And so all of these distances between these rows is really important. The fact that this is the same distance from here to here is important, and that that's similar all the way down the line if you want a consistent crease. So remember that while you're kind of working on all of this stuff. Yeah, so right there, we want to bring that up and out a little bit. These are kind of getting all brought out of shape. So we're going to want to take these interior vertices and pull those back out. So that probably happened when we were either adding some edge loops and didn't notice, or bending some things around. We didn't grab all the vertices like we should have. I'm not really sure, but it did happen. So we'll pay attention to that. And you'll get used to seeing sort of in the wireframe view, like what you're looking at. The more you rotate as you have stuff selected, the easier it is to see depth-wise, like where stuff is at. Okay, so we don't want any big anomalies like that poking out. because it will kind of wreck the illusion. So I'm inside of something here, pull out. Okay. And odds are we're not really going to see most of that because we're going to be close to, you know, we're going to be back out here when we're looking at this thing, if not further away. So you can imagine how insignificant those kind of details are right now, but, you know, aim for correctness. All right. So one other thing we can do is grab a cylinder. You can see there's a lot of edges here. So I'm going to open up the tools palette. If we go down to the bottom here, you can see the options for the current object we just added. And it's important that we haven't moved this yet or done anything to it because these options will disappear. But right now it's live. So as I kind of scroll through this, it will change the number of edges. And since I'm going to use a subsurf modifier, and this isn't going to be super noticeable, I'm going to take this down to 6 sides. And I don't need caps, so I'm going to take that off so there's not any caps there. And now what I can do to automatically add a subsurf is join this to this object that already has one. So to do that, all I need to do is right-click this object, shift right-click the object I want to connect it with to make it one mesh, hit Control-J, and that will automatically merge those. So now, when I go into edit mode with that selected, those are both part of the same object. So I'm going to make this real small, rotate this by 90 degrees. And put this into place. So some of this may need to be altered based on changes that we make to the mesh or whatever, but until then, it will kind of serve its purpose. Because we added this in later, we need to smooth out those surface normals as well. So we'll hit smooth, and now you'll see that that's smoothed out quite a bit more. And that just kind of grounds, you know, that into the side as it's got a little axle or something that it's spinning on. All right, I'm going to leave that right there for now, and then we can start working on the wheel. I'm going to possibly try to get that in there. So just saw a message from Lorian saying the underside of the airfoil needs to be flat. So let's do that. Let's make it flat. So here's an easy way to do that. We'll grab all these underside vertices, and to do a row selection like that, you can hit Shift and then Alt to right click and select an entire loop of edges. If you just want to select between two vertices though, so I'm going to turn off the subsurf so you can see these. If you just want to select from here to here, you select the first one with the right click, and then you hold Control and then right click the second one, and it'll select all the vertices connected in between. All right, so now we want to flatten this out. So easiest way to do this is to scale it by 0 on the z-axis. So all that's going to do if you have, you know, a downward sloping set of vertices is go and scale them by 0, because anything times 0 is 0. So SZ0, and that will flatten them out perfectly on the Y or the Z-axis. And then we can just move those down. And yeah, it's pretty good. If we want to get another row in there to create a crease on the underside, we could loop cut here, and that might be enough to crease that up as it is there. Another option would be to jump into face selection mode, grab all of these interior edges or faces on the bottom. Then if you hit I for inset, that's like extruding to the inside of something. And that will allow you to create an interior row of faces on a selection. So that will also do it. So it's really kind of up to you, or you can bevel. All of those are valid options. Sometimes turning off that subsurf can really kind of show you what sections are feeling off and need to be played with. So I'm going to line these up a little bit better. So those are flat. And we'll do the same thing kind of over here. And we probably need to bring all of this actually down to where it's the same kind of thickness, tapering up a little bit. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. So it gets thicker as it goes back. Not sure if that's accurate, but it feels right kind of right now. You can also hit scale on the z-axis by 0, and then if you don't type in the 0, SZ to start scaling, and then you just want to move towards the middle of the screen, it'll start flattening that out, but you can dial that in with your mouse. So that's another option you have for making it feel a little bit more accurate there. Okay. Thinner in the back. All right, so we probably need to move these up a little bit. So we're gonna slide this up. So hit G twice, and that will let you slide any direction using the yellow as a guide. I wanna go up on this vertex or this edge. So I'm gonna hit / on the numpad to isolate just this object so we can see the back of it. I wanna do this. Might kind of taper this down a little bit. Wow, this got all kinds of messed up back here. So just slide these back into place. Sometimes that can happen. So you just have to kind of pay attention and be willing to be a little patient with things. It's looking a little bit better. Again, it's tempting to come in here and spend a whole lot of time fixing all this up, but I know we're never going to see it. So experience will you know, tell me to kind of wrap this up. If it was the front side, I'd be a lot more, you know, concerned, but so anyways, kind of even that out a little bit, should get rid of most of the problems. And then if we're still having issues, again, we just need to pull these back so they're smoothing out as they are subdivided. So anyways, kind of messy, but gets the job done. If I was going to model this, I would spend more time kind of working on this topology and making sure that it was cleaner for, you know, an object that was going to be kind of a hero object. But this is going to be fine just the way that it is. So okay. So one of the things we might do, since we're getting some weird kind of pinching right here, is get rid of the face that's right there. And might actually run a line from one side over to the other as a loop. So one of the things we can do is get rid of these two. And if we try to loop cut it, it's going to do some crazy stuff. So I'm going to knife cut this instead. So we're going to start here, go to here. Join this up in the middle. So select two vertices, Alt M to merge. And now we've got quads again. But now we've got some options here. Okay, so two cuts there, create an edge there, and then we will join these up, create kind of a new flow for these polygons. I just want to make sure both sides are kind of doing the exact same thing in terms of the edge flow. And so fix a little bit of that weird pinching so they feel like they flow into that corner a little more. Yeah, so we still don't have a crease on any of this because we haven't beveled it or anything. So we need to sort of figure out what we want to do. And in this case, I'm going to select these edges and inset them. So I think it'll do a little bit better job for us. We're getting some weird things happening when those cross over. So sometimes we can change that by looking at the options at the bottom of the screen. So we've got control for the depth, which is if it's going to come off the surface that it's on now and go in or out of the mesh. So I don't really want to do that. Outset is off, which can control whether you're going to go outside and outset or inside and inset. So in this case, I want to go the other way. So I'm going to hit I, escape and I to start that again. I is what I hit accidentally, and that'll switch it to every face that you have selected individually gets inset. So that's handy sometimes if you want to do that. But in this case, I want to do them as one giant section here. So boundary is another option that you can turn on and off. And if you're using mirror modifier, sometimes that's necessary. But again, not going to help us in this case. Okay, so we're just going to have to manually kind of fix some of this. And that's pretty easy with edge slide. So we're just tapping G twice to pull these back into place. Make sure we're not getting any sort of weird crossovers because that will create a really odd looking mesh. And there you go. So again, may not be the perfect wing here, but it's all we really need it to be for this model. good enough for now. So one of the other things I'm going to do is try to get both sides kind of looking a little bit closer to each other in terms of that corner. Yeah, it's a little better. Okay, enough time spent on this. So, I was hoping to move on to the wheel here, but I'm not sure we're gonna have time right now. So, we got a little bit of modeling in. So let's jump back into sculpting. That is not sculpting, that is edit mode. Don't want that. Okay, do want to share something that I found today as I was working on an ebook for you guys. That will be coming out very soon, but I still have to kind of get all my pictures and everything together for it. It's going to be 10 ways to level up your skills in Blender, and it's going to be full of lots of useful information. So that is going to be coming your way soon. It'll be absolutely free to you guys. So as long as you're on the mailing list, it will be free. All right, switching on the mat cap. The computer's chugging a little bit right now, so I'm going to save in case we have the stream go down or something crazy. Okay, I'm going to leave it on this one right now. And so the thing I wanted to show you guys was an add-on for sculpting that is must be bundled with Blender because I don't think I downloaded it. So if you go to your user preferences to the add-ons, you can search for Sculpt, and the Sculpting Tools UI is, I think, what I checked. I'm not sure that's it. No, this is it. Sculpt paintbrush menus is the one that I found. So you can search it, or if you go to sculpting and filter with that, then it will pop up right here. And not that one, but it's actually in the 3D view. So it's in here somewhere. But what it does is it adds all of the information here on the left side in the tools palette over into your 3D viewport if you hit Alt-V while you're in sculpt or paint mode. So with that checked off and enabled, you can have a little user preference right here. You can switch around on that. But with that on, if you hit Alt-V, it'll pop up this little brush options palette, and we'll let you change your current brush or any of these settings like radius, strength. You can change literally everything the exact same way you would on the left side. So pretty cool. I actually have found that today I like having this little menu up, so I'm going to leave that up instead, but thought I'd share that with you guys because I thought you might find it useful. Okay, let's get in here and play with some of this stuff. Okay, so pretty much everything here has been tightened up fairly well. One of the things we want to start looking into is how we're going to get this merging into the sphere. And if you notice on the right side, make sure I have my reference back up. I do. There's a little notch here that sort of snakes its way up into this piece. So we need to kind of put that in a little bit. So let's grab our clay strips, go to the bottom view here. And this goes all the way through our mesh. So we're going to want to dig from about to where this porthole starts on this side. If you draw a straight line down from there, A little bit over is going to be where that starts. So if that's there, we should be somewhere about here. So we'll just dig in, create a line. And then this will help us kind of figure out what we need to do here. Now, I've played a little bit with my resolution, so I want to make sure we're still at a decent size here, because the higher resolution we make this, the harder it's going to be to kind of tweak this right now. So you can see that blending into the sphere here as we take that down. And I want to get it to where less than like halfway through this sphere, it's already kind of blended into the mesh. So we're going to start carving in to pull this further up in the z-axis. And yeah, so it's doing well. If we need to bring it back, we can just do a little additive stroke there. And yeah, so we've got a little notch. If we need to kind of make these a little bit more angular, we can kind of plan halfway down. We'll be or maybe a little bit over here. We need to have a little crease, and then it needs to go up further. So let's do a little pinch. Go back to the bottom view here. Right about over here. Let's pinch this up. That's a little hard to see, so I'm going to switch this over to the other mat cap. You know what? Crease might actually be a little bit easier to see. Yeah, let's do this. Okay, so everything on this side needs to be flattened down to where it meets up with that crease level. So we can just kind of inch our way to the left and get this thing flattened down. And once that line starts disappearing, you know that you're kind of at the right level. Okay. Check this. It's pretty close. Might go a little deeper here. Turn this up a little bit more. Okay, then we can kind of build back towards that top over here using our clay strips. So zoom in a little bit towards this hump over here. We'll just kind of layer up some clay and smooth that back down on the crease. See how that's looking. So we've got our sort of 45-degree angle kind of back there. And now we'll just kind of really softly go in and flatten this down. So I'll lower this back down to something pretty tame. Flatten that. It's kind of subtle what's happening with the shading, so you have to really kind of pay attention to what's going on to see the movement and make sure you're doing what you need to do. And what I recommend doing is once you've got this kind of going, don't stay in one area for too long before you move around and check that it's doing what you need it to do. Otherwise, you're going to find that you've gone too far and you're going to have to undo some of the stuff you just did. So let's turn this up a little bit. I'm going to flatten down a little closer to that line. And then go back up, flatten over here on these edges. So it's a little harder than it is the concept art because you have to remember this is curved. So you need to have the same kind of width all the way around this cylindrical object. And to do that, it's not always easy. So we can keep playing with the flatten a little bit, But what we may need to do is go in and carve some more out with clay strips. So I'm gonna pull these sides down. Luckily we've got mirroring turned on, so this won't take long to kind of get here. And then we'll just go back and again, flatten. Okay, so that's kind of doing a little bit more what we need it to do there. And the only thing left to do is increase the contrast on this line. So just take a little bit out. On that edge. And that's all you gotta do. Okay, so I want to get this line across the middle kind of straightened out. So we need to bring back enough that we get it all sort of on the same line as it's crossing the sphere. So left to right, build this out a little bit at a time. Okay, so that's good. And just want to smooth. Okay, so lost a tiny bit, bring that back. And this time I'm going to flatten. A bit easier to control. Smooth really just kind of just goes nuts and flattens everything back out. So got to be careful with smooth. Okay. So too hard, pull this back. We're just going to try to seamlessly blend this in where it meets that sphere. It looks like we don't really have the sphere centered because this is sort of asymmetrically off here, but that's okay because we're gonna eventually have to turn off the symmetry and just start going for it on our own. Okay, and get it close, and then anything else that isn't perfect will blend in towards the funnel when we merge the sphere. Darkside Fox, thanks for commenting. And no, this actually is Blender, not ZBrush. So would you guys like me to merge the sphere at this point and kind of show you what I'm going to do with the other side, flatten that down and kind of make it a little bit more blocky? Or do you want to work more on creasing up lines and details and all that stuff? Or what would you like to see, since there's a few of you in the stream right now? Okay, so you want me to connect the sphere. Let's do that then. So let's go back to object mode. We've got our sphere. Right now it's still a subsurf. Lorian wants me to do the paddle wheel. So I'll try to do a little bit of both. All right, so we've got our subsurf here. This is all nice and pretty, but we're gonna have to eventually lose this so we can merge it with the sculpt, which is gross. So I'm gonna duplicate a copy of this, move it to the next layer, so we have a backup in case I screw up. I'm gonna save everything. Let's go ahead and hit Alt-C to convert to a mesh, which will just basically apply the modifiers all in one command. So you can see these are all now live shapes, which means we can combine this to our object here. And the only reason I'm combining these is because I need to kind of seamlessly sculpt that line between the two. And then on the other side, they're actually going to be one giant object. So that's the only reason. Otherwise, I would do what I'm doing here with this little fin or the paddle wheel and just leave it completely unconnected, or the stem for that matter. That's not going to be connected. So don't do this unless you need to do it, because it's hard on your system, and obviously just adds a lot more headache to deal with sculpting around. So let's go back to our sculpt menu. And this is an add-on that I got from GitHub on Google. So if you just search Blender Sculpt Tools, you can download this for free. And all you need to do is hit Union, and it will merge those together. So it's going to take a second. Then we got it done now. And no, those are one object. So you can see it tried to kind of smooth a little bit, but now this will be much easier to blend because that's all one object. Okay, so let's jump back into sculpt mode and play a little bit. Okay, so it disabled my dynamic topology because it found some quads and knows that that could be an issue. So we could try re-enabling, but it may just give us another error. Not sure. Okay, so in this case, it worked. I'm assuming as we start sculpting, it's going to turn these into triangles, but I'm not sure. So to remesh this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the strength way down to something like 0.05 on one of my tools over here that has dynamic topology turned on. So if you're used to ZBrush, this is the same as the dynamic topology over there. It's just that it does it on the fly as you're sort of painting on a mesh. So you can see all of the original squares here. And as I smooth this out, you're going to see this has added quite a few more polys. As I zoom in, you can see all of those. So I'm going to zoom out back here, brush over the areas I want to be kind of remeshed, and then in wireframe, you can see all the points that have been added. And now if I smooth out, jump to my smooth tool, make sure that is turned up. It is. Okay, so I'm not getting as much of a smooth as I want. Let's turn this up and see if it will do it for us. There we go. Okay, so yeah, now you can see all those little edges, micro edges smoothing out there. So because we got close before we combined, it's a pretty easy job to kind of mesh these together into one piece. And what I like is that the way we did this, we can keep this really sharp edge and make it look kind of like however we want. So what I'm going to do on this side is I'm going to turn off symmetry so that we're not going to screw up the details on this other side over here. And I'm going to go to town kind of making this sort of look blocky. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to switch over to flatten, and I'm not going to smooth, I'm just going to flatten. And we're going to keep dynamic topology turned on. Let's keep it at about 85 right now. That's good. And let's get going. Okay, so no smoothing, just flattening. And actually, let's take this down to about 50. You can see how that just totally blows through any of your sharp details and just kind of like really destroys that. So the lower you go here, the more blocky everything's going to get. But that's kind of what I want this to be. I want this to be sort of like a raw cut of this material, because this is like, it's like a mineral that's washed up in the ocean, and then they come in and they carve this stuff into these pipes. And So the idea here would be that like maybe it's not finished, or maybe they just decided they want to do one side and keep the rest of it like really kind of angular. So we're going to kind of blend these details in on one side and make it feel like it's been just starting to be carved, or maybe it's still really kind of bumpy the way it would be if it was still in its mineral form before it got hardened. So you can see how ridgy that's sort of getting. And what's great about this is we can pick and choose like what details we want to leave in and what details we don't. So towards the other side of this pipe edge right here, like I'm not going to get too messy, and I am going to actually smooth right about here because I want to make sure I'm keeping all of this stuff here. So let's add some of this back. So using clay strips here, I'm going to turn the strength up a little bit. It's very important to remember when you have symmetry turned on and when you don't have it turned on, because it can wreck your day. Okay, so I'm gonna flatten some more until we get kind of everything blocked in the way that it's supposed to look, and then I'll go through and do a really quick smoothing pass, and then I'll start sharpening up some of these edges. And I'll kind of show you what the idea is. I'm not going to touch the top of it too much. Okay. So let's add in some clay strips, smooth that out a little bit, blending this into the sphere a little bit more. Okay, let's do a smoothing pass, and I'm going to turn this way down. Let's do something like 0.1. And this is just going to take everything that I've already done and make sure that we're not getting any of these sort of blocky triangles that are here. Okay. So now I want to come in with clay strips, and I really want to start defining some areas that are sort of angular and blocky. And we can, in this case, we're adding clay. If we hold Control, we can remove it. And the more contrast you want, the more you can kind of bunch addition and subtraction strokes up next to each other. So now when we go back and smooth, make this real big. So that's way turned down. Let's make this 0.25. So it's not going to get rid of it, but it's just going to take all those little bitty peaks and valleys out of there until we're just left with the big blocky shapes. And then we can go in with pinch and really kind of dial up some of these sharper corners. And if you're not getting enough with pinch, you can switch this over to crease and kind of go the other way. Now it's going to give you a totally different effect. So what I would recommend is if you're going to do that, you'd go back with pinch and tighten those up as well. You can see with this turned up to a 0.7, which is pretty high, that you can get kind of a sharper, rocky kind of texture pretty easily. And if you overwork it, it can get to where it doesn't look great anymore. So you want to make sure you're not going over areas 2, 3, 4, 5 times, but just enough to get what you need. And that's only if you've got this turned up as high as I do right here. So a couple of strokes back and forth is really all you need, if that. So before we get too far in here and are playing with that, I want to make sure I kind of like what we're getting on this side. So I'm going to pull out a bit and then block in some bigger forms here before we get to where we're creasing these up. And the idea is like to blend this into the really smooth shaded parts of the sphere. So it's almost like somebody took this raw piece of material and they wanted to show like this hybrid of how it would look at an early stage and like a late stage. So it's almost like the rough sculpts and the clean sculpts in one model, which I think is really cool. Another option you have for kind of making this sort of work out for you is to use alphas as your sculpting, which we haven't really talked about yet because all the objects we've been doing have been hand sculpted. But if you want to really get in here and create skin textures and all sorts of stuff like that, learning to sculpt with alpha textures is really what you're going to need to do. And I can demonstrate that a little bit if we get time. Okay. So it's kind of like there's these bigger chunks of rock layering and stuff. And as we near the middle part of this ship where that seam, that center line is, I'm going to kind of steer away and blend it back in because I don't want to miss out on an opportunity to add detail on that center line. Okay, so let's carve in a little bit. Now, one of the things you can do to actually create a lot of different variation in your strokes is we usually have this kept to a smooth curve right here, but you can play with several sculpting curves or actually just move these points around and create your own. But this one, as it slopes down, creates sort of a tip right here going out to the side. So this is sort of a sharp angle. And if you are sort of digging in, it will create more of a peak as you're going in that way. So that's one option you have. And this does the same thing, just less so. So not really sure if you can see that. Let me switch over to my sculpt draw and show you here. So yeah, you can see what that does, kind of more like what the crease does. Or if you want to go out and do a peak, you can do this and it will kind of draw a peak on a surface with this curve. This will do rounded shapes. So if you want more hill type sections, you can do that. And so that one's pretty tall. This one's a little bit more spherical and shallower. So yeah, this one will go with no transitional fall off whatsoever. So if you just want blocks all the way through, you can do that. Now, despite what you might be thinking for this one, there are good uses for this. And one of them would be like for the grab tool. This means that you're not going to have any sort of transition when you're grabbing a big chunk of the clay if you select this linear type option. So if I grab this end over here and I want to move this whole thing, it'll grab a big chunk without any sort of fall off, and you can see what that does there, which is how I masked off and sort of extruded up this chunk of clay here for this little porthole. So yeah, there are some uses just depending on what you're doing. So this might be fun. We could play with blob a little bit and see what kind of shapes we get with this. Let's turn up the size here. Now, too big and we're gonna get it really slowing down on us, but we can also go in on objects, which I think is really cool. And we'll automatically create like a crater sort of look as you're sculpting. So if we want to create something that's a little bit more like pits or something, we can do that and then kind of play with flatten on top of this. And you can see the effects we get. Creates these little plateaus. So this really makes it feel like we're using some clay, and I've gotten really chunky and messy over here on the side. But this can be a fun way to sculpt, especially if you're doing conceptual stuff like we're doing here, and you just want to play with shapes. You can create a big mesh, blob it out for a whole lot of material bunched up, and then just go in with some tools and start trying to make it look like something. That can be fun too. So let's see what's happening here. Might smooth this out a little bit. Okay. One of the things I thought about doing on this side is actually flattening the sphere quite a bit. So we've got like a sort of a grip or something for the pipe, for your thumb if you're holding it like this. So it's kind of an interesting idea. So you can see kind of where your hand would rest in there somewhere. Round out the corners. Okay. We can blob to the inside. And as we push out and flatten those sides, we're going to get more of a sort of curved shape to this cavity in here. So it's not just a rounded out sort of thing. It's got a crease on the edge of it. Got a little bit of a lip. So keep it smooth on the inside, and then towards this edge, we'll push that clay, flatten that down. So there you go. Kind of see what that's doing. Okay. So the trick to this sort of angular feel is going to be flatten a little bit and then rotate, flatten a little bit and then rotate. And the more you rotate to another view, the more angles you're going to add to the shape to make it feel blocky. But if you just stay in one place, all you're going to get is, you know, a really flat surface that kind of ruins all the work we did. But it doesn't take long to get in here and once you've kind of got the workflow down, you're able to repeat the process and make it look consistent, and you know. Lorian says their archaeologist smokes with their left hand, apparently. Yes, apparently so. Or, interestingly, we could get this whole thing finished and then just scale it by a -1 on the other side and invert the model so it's on the right side. So there's always a way in 3D to get something that you need. She, of course, is referring to the archaeologist in this month's 3D illustration. So this work is kind of mindless and fun, albeit a little tedious. But what's cool is, like, you see how this is, we'll start off really sharp and rocky on this side, and then it'll just kind of seamlessly blend into the rest of the ship as we go around. And yeah, just something about that. I like the unfinished feel of part of it. And of course, the trick is making it look intentional, not like you're screwing up. But the interesting thing is we're probably not even going to see this side. So it doesn't matter what we choose, because for the 3D illustration, it's going to have to sit on the desk. And we're obviously going to want to showcase the side that has all of the details, which is kind of why I decided this was okay. Okay, almost on my left. All right, 8:30. So before I spend the rest of the time just doing what I'm doing now, we'll crease this up a little bit, try to get to some of it to a little bit more of a finished state, and then we'll move on to something else. Sound good, everybody? Let's save in case the stream crashes tonight. Okay. So now we got to switch gears a little bit. These are going to be quick strokes that are linear, straight, because we're trying to get corners in here, and we have the strength turned up pretty high, so we don't need to spend a lot of time, you know, scrubbing back and forth with our pen to get these peaky sort of effects with our crease tool. But we do want to kind of follow a pattern here, so the more we can keep short, straight strokes, not get too crazy, going curvy back and forth, the better off we're going to be, because the goal is to make this sort of look blocky. Now, we also want to try to achieve some randomness, so don't get too much into like a hexagonal pattern or something like that, like a beehive, when you're doing this, because unless that's what you're trying to do, is you want this to feel like it's sort of natural in the way that it's formed. So depending on what you're going for, maybe you do want to curve some of these strokes, but it just needs to be a conscious decision, and then you kind of need to stick with whatever method you pick, because it's going to be obvious that you're just bad at sculpting if you don't have a consistent, you know, stroke. Zooming out will give you the ability to get more done quickly and also widen your ability to crease things, because your tool will stay the same size as you zoom. So the closer you go, you know, the longer you have to get your strokes and all of that. So out here, I can get a lot done real fast. And so we'll go around the sort of edge of this pipe here and create this inner wall. I'm just really trying to keep that smooth edge, that smooth stroke, so I'm not getting all wobbly with everything. The crease is kind of forgiving. I mean, if you screw up, you can undo or just go back over the line, and it's not going to be too bad. But the more you pay attention, you know, the better it's going to look. So, but this is a good way to create sand dunes and all sorts of stuff. Zooming in and out will also vary the width of your crease. So if you're trying to get a lot of, you know, organic variation, that can be a good thing too. Or you can always just constantly change the radius of your tool over here. That'll do it as well. Okay, so the middle is actually right down here. And what we probably want to do is spend a little bit of time transitioning this over, flattening this down a little bit. Not a lot, because we don't want to lose that rounded shape that we spent a lot of time on yesterday. But with the right texture, even where we have it right now can be a really cool mineral type look. So, anybody have any questions or anything they want me to talk about? I'm all ears. So Lauren asks, am I working my mouse in one hand and my stylus in the other? Yeah, so I'm left-handed and my stylus is in my left hand, and I'm not using any of the keyboard shortcuts or anything like that as I go right now, because I need to be rotating. So my right hand is on my middle mouse wheel, and I'm just my right hand is clicking on the middle mouse wheel, and then my pen is moving on the tablet. I'm not touching the tablet, I'm just moving my pen around. And since it's wireless, it knows kind of where my mouse would be. So I can use my mouse if I want to use that instead of my tablet. I don't have to do it that way. But that way, all I have to do is click with my right hand on the middle mouse wheel, and I can keep rotating till I find a good spot, stop clicking with my right hand, and then go back to sculpting. And it's a really quick workflow. And if you're used to ZBrush or something like that, you actually don't need to use both hands, because to navigate in ZBrush, all you have to do is click out here with your tablet in the sort of blank space in your canvas, and that will let you just freehand rotate around. So they've kind of solved that option another way. But there's always room for improvement, no matter what software you're using. So Blender is about to get some major overhauls, which I'm very excited about. Yeah, so I mean, there are working solutions for getting around that, but in fact, if you want to assign a middle mouse button click to your pen, see I have a couple of buttons here in my pen. I don't know if you guys can see that. I can click and then drag, and it will replace my mouse. So I don't actually have to use my mouse, but since I don't have that set up on my pen, I need to do that way. So smooth all this out over here. One of the things we never did is went back in and replaced all of these quads with triangles with Dynamesh. So we're gonna do that. So there I go again. Dynamesh is ZBrush. Dynamic topology is Blender. Man, if I ever teach both, it's gonna get nuts because I'm never gonna remember the terminology from one to the other. So with this turned down really low, I'm just adding geometry. And you can see that if I switch into wireframe view, what that's doing. And then I'll go back with Shift and I'll just use that same stroke to smooth this out. So it just gives me the ability to smooth this out with a lot of polygons. And, you know, the temptation is to go do this for the whole mesh right away. Which you can do if you want to detail flood the entire mesh, that's an option. And more like how you would work in ZBrush because they don't have dynamic topology where you paint new geometry as you go. It's all just one level, at least as far as I remember. So to detail flood, you would basically pick your resolution right here that you would use for your regular dynamic topology, hit detail flood, and it will completely wipe the entire mesh with that same level of resolution. So you could start at a low resolution and then just kind of work your way up to higher and higher resolutions as you go. And that's a perfectly fine way to work. So yeah, I keep my keyboard kind of in front of me, right in front of my monitors. My tablet's right behind that on my desk. And then to the right of that is my mouse. And that's in response to a question Lorian had in the chat. Okay. So I really only add geometry like I'm doing right now to a place that I feel like I need to add it to either add more detail or do what I'm doing now, which is to smooth it out. In the end, there is an option to just smooth the model. And so we don't actually have to do all of this extra addition of polygons and everything. But if you're going to add detail to the mesh, it makes sense to do it this way, which I think I may go back and add some textures there. So anyways, so all that's left to do, guys, is go in here and kind of decide more about what we want to do with the bumpy rockiness over here of this mineral, if we like what we're seeing, or if we want to make it kind of some different organic shapes there, even smaller details possible if we want to go in and add some of that stuff. So one of the things I'm going to show you before we kind of wrap tonight up is how to create some of your own textures for alphas as you're sculpting. And this is really handy because if you really want to do fine detail on sculptures, this is what you need to do. So any of your brushes, as you're going through and looking at all your options here, if you look for the texture dropdown, you'll have an image that you can select. Now, these are only going to be selectable if you have images loaded into your current Blender file. So if you want to create a new one, you just hit this new button and you'll call it whatever you want to call it. In this case, we'll call it, I don't know, we'll just call this one pores. This will change the mode of how you stencil whatever texture you're painting with onto your mesh. And so it's still going to use this basic overall tool, but it's now going to use whatever texture you assign to. So if you don't want any of this, you can just hit X and not use a texture. But if you want one, you can do it here. So to add one, let's jump out of edit mode or sculpt mode real fast. And I actually need to create a texture that we're going to use. So let's load a new screen up in our UV editor here. Gonna get rid of that image file right there. And I need to pull up in Photoshop and paint a texture. So these need to be black and white because they're kind of like bump maps in the sense that they give you depth. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to create a new file. You can make these any resolution you want, but they need to pretty much be square. So let's say we make a 1K texture, 1024 by 1024. And we can fill it with white or black, or maybe even a gray value, and kind of go both ways. But in this case, I'm going to fill it with white, create a new layer, and let's create some texture here. So to do this quickly, I'm just going to grab a brush from one of my brush sets over here. Pull this over here. Okay, I'm going to find something that has some texture on it. And hopefully we can use this to help us with our mineral on one side or the other. And want to kind of play with some of these to see what they need to look like. We want a lot of variation in here. So I'm going to try to get a really good version in here that will give us something to play with. Something like this. And we'll just create some random stuff here. Like this a little better. Let's start with this. Okay, so these are either going to bump out or bump in, and I don't really remember which direction it's going to go until we get in there, but we can probably invert it either way, so it won't really be a problem. And yeah. So what I would recommend is either getting something that stays away from the edges, and you can just pull that texture in the way that it currently sits, or you can make this texture repeatable. So Lauren's asking me why my PS brushes have Chinese characters. The guy that I follow, that I got this brush set from, is Chinese. So he's a concept artist. I think his screen name is WLOP on Gumroad. So if you guys want to follow him, you can get, if you buy any of his tutorials or anything like that, you can get his brush set for free with anything on Patreon or something like that. And I am just happening to use some of his brushes right now because those are what I have loaded up. So this should be good enough to kind of get us going, and I'll kind of show you what the effect is. So I'm going to save a PNG of this. We'll call this Pores Alpha. Once that's done, I'll load this into Blender. And let's open this. Now, there isn't an alpha channel on this. It's just a black and white image. But they're called alphas, if that makes sense. These texture sets. So we're now going to go back to sculpt mode. Go back to our textures down here. And what we need to do is load this image into this texture right here. And so we can do that by going over to the texture palette that will show up over here in your properties panel. And you want to make sure you're under the correct brush, so we can select the mask. So the mask tool that we were using, you can actually create a custom alpha for the mask if that helps. But in this case, we'll select our brush pores, and then we want to grab that image that we just loaded. So pores alpha right here. If you have an alpha, you can use it, but I don't. And so we'll just kind of see what this is doing. So yeah, I'll start off with Sculpt Draw, and we can just kind of see what effect we're having. So there's some settings here we're going to want to change to make this way more spaced out and not as tightly packed. Some of that can be done under the stroke settings. So we can turn the spacing up quite a bit, and now that will spread out our stroke here. I'm going to undo that. Check on our curve, and it looks like we have that still set to constant. So we want to take this back down to smooth. And so now you can see what that's doing in terms of these little pores. And we're also going to want to turn our resolution up quite a bit more. So since the detail is so small here, we make this bigger, and as you scale up the size, you can actually see the texture ghosted right there. So now if I paint, you're going to see that image texture show up with our stroke. Now, that is not the effect we want, obviously, but you can see with our strength turned up, that's what it's going to do. It's going to bulge out or do a clay strip or whatever it normally does, and then it's going to add that texture on top of it. So let's undo that and then turn our strength way back down to something like a 0.1, because we really just want to do this on the surface. It's very minute detail, so no depth really. So now we can just make one big stroke, and you can see the little bitty details we're getting now. And this is how you do anything, how you do scales for lizards or skin, pores for skin, or rock textures or whatever. If you want to bake it into the normal map from your high-res sculpts into a retopologized model, this is what you got to do. So right now we're adding, we can undo this, we could subtract instead. So we'll do this. Now you can see, because our map is sort of inverted, you can see we're getting the opposite effect. So what should be going in is now coming out. And that's because our colors are not the correct way around. So what we need to do is go back into Blender, and we need to actually invert this map. So I'm going to hit Control I on the white layer, Control I on the black for this, and we can resave this now and reload it. Now, one of the things we might want to do again is make this tileable. So the way you would do that quickly in Photoshop is if you go to Filter, Other, you go to Offset, and you basically divide the width and height of your document in half, and then you type those numbers in. So since we did a 1024 by 1024, those numbers are actually correct already. 512 by 512 is 1024 divided by 2. So we will select this with wraparound, and so hit OK. And now basically anything that is in this cross section that is obviously out of place, we just paint over it. So usually there'd be, like if it was a photograph that was edge to edge, you'd see a seam down the middle making a cross. So what we need to do here instead is make some more dots to fill in these gaps, so there's not just a bunch of black space. So here we need to invert this to a white pattern, make this bigger, and I'm erasing. So let's switch back to this. And all I'm trying to do right now is kind of fill in these gaps. Okay, so I wanted to see if I could find another dot pattern, maybe something like this. Okay. And so we just kind of repeat this a couple of times until we notice that the offset is not got any seams or anything like that happening. So eventually you're going to have a texture that is perfectly, perfectly tileable throughout a scene, no matter where it's put. And the trick is to really just stay away from all the edges as you're painting over those seams, and you should be golden. So yeah. Now, one of the big things to remember as you're doing this is not to leave any big areas that will be noticeable when it repeats. So you're not going to probably notice the dots, but you will notice these bigger areas in the middle. So we need to find something to get rid of those so they're not quite as noticeable. So I'm going to take these little middle gray value areas and I'm going to use dots and kind of erase out some of how they look. So it's not immediately noticeable that this whole thing is just happening again. Okay, so there's a little bit of a subtle texture back there, but it's not enough to probably throw up any red flags. You can check that one more time with an offset. You know, and if we're worried, just create some contrast as we get in here. And there we go. So anything that lines up, anything that has a pattern that's recognizable, make sure you get rid of it because you will see it somewhere. Okay, so now let's resave this as a PNG. Okay, still not gonna save any alpha information, so no transparency here. And then let's reload this image. Okay, so that's already been populated throughout Blender. You can see it update there and there. Merge that window back up, and now subtract should actually subtract. So we paint that in there. You can see it actually cutting into the mesh. And this is a pretty high-res alpha for these kind of details on this model. So we could actually turn the detail size up even higher to something like 600 was as high as I went on the spoon when we were doing that model. So if you want to, you can go that high, and it'll take a bit of time to, you know, add that much detail to a model, because you're going to start getting millions and millions and millions of polys on your mesh as you do that. But you can see as far as we zoom in here, till you're this close, it's not really getting chunky. So even at this distance, it's pretty dang good. But why you would need to get that high res with a model that's going to be at this distance in the image, you don't. So use your best judgment here. So in my case, I'm going to let's stick with 200. And I'm going to pull back out to about here. Just play with this. Now, technically, you'd want to put this type of texture over the entire model because this whole thing is made out of this stuff. But as you've got in here and started sanding this stuff down, you would have less of it on the areas that have been worked and smoothed as you sculpted those. So you really only need it to look really chunky on the side that has all the areas that haven't been carved yet. And like I said, if you get a texture in here that repeats the way it should, especially if you're zooming in and out at different levels, you shouldn't see any seams. It should be pretty easy to cover this mesh up without any problems. And right now, this is based on the way we're rotated around the mesh, so it's going to project this straight into your model. If you want to play with some other methods, you can change this from viewing plane to, you can tile it. And in this case, again, we have a tiled texture, so this will work. And now when we stroke with this back to back with other strokes, it's going to tile this seamlessly across the mesh. So we may want to turn the spacing down a little bit here at this point. Undo that real fast. Lauren's asking, do we always use a PNG when you create a brush for Blender? In my case, I do, because PNG tends to be uncompressed and they're bigger file sizes, but for textures that are that small, I'm using PNGs for my 4K textures for my other parts of the illustration anyways. And PNGs will, unlike JPEGs, they don't compress and create artifacts in the texture image. And so when you're working on super high resolution stuff, you need to have sort of the best version of your image. So TIFFs, even 16-bit TIFFs, which are full of color information and probably a little unnecessary for your alphas, but PNGs definitely, targets will work because they've got transparency, and really PNGs are why I use, because of the versatility is why I use them for almost all of my image sets in Blender, because they also have the ability to have an alpha, just like targets do. So you can, really get in there and use them for any part of the program. So you can see with tiling on what it will do is just kind of repeat and blend together a little bit better. Angle will change the rotation of your texture, and so I'll show you a little bit of that in a second. But you go random, which helps, 3D, which will actually add depth a little bit, which is cool. And then stencil is a really cool thing. So if you're doing like skin or specific parts of like a, let's say an emblem, like a cross or something, you want to be engraved into something, you can grab an image texture of that, select stencil, and then by right-clicking and holding that and moving it around your screen, you can pick where you want this to be projected onto your mesh. And so if I want to paint this way, basically I just get this image lined up where I want it, and then I can just kind of follow the guide of the image and stencil it on there. So now I'm just basically painting. And if I move that out of the way, you can see, again, it just projects that down onto the model. But the benefit of this is you can see what is happening before you do it, right? So let me move this around a little bit more and see if I can remember some of those other keyboard shortcuts. Yeah, so if you hold Control and right click, you can rotate this alpha. So right click will move it around, right click and drag. Control, right click and drag will change the rotation of this. Shift, right click and drag will change the size of it. And so there you go. You got all the options you need to really dial in your stenciled textures pretty accurately. So yeah, if we had an alpha on this, or it was tiled, you wouldn't have these seams. Obviously, if you want to avoid those, you can pull your image texture over to an area. And I'm waiting for this to undo real fast, so give me a second. So I can pull this image texture over, make the image a little bigger here, and then I just don't paint anywhere near the edges. So if I just paint here, then I'm not going to get those as a problem. So yeah, depending on what you're doing, the rotation and everything with stencil could be a cool option. But in my case, view plane is probably the easiest thing to use. So use that. And again, the smaller you make your brush and you get these settings dialed in, the faster things will speed up and all of that. So in my case, I probably want to stay out here quite a bit further so that I'm not getting too small with those details for this mesh. And ultimately, again, this side may not even be seen, but I probably will want to showcase this with a 360 turntable or something for the portfolio, so in that case, it helps to finish the model all the way up. And anything that, we want to get rid of, it's just like any other part of your mesh, you can just smooth it away. So switch back to another tool, get rid of this texture by hitting this little X so it's not selecting anything. And now you're just back to regular sculpting. So I can hit Shift and just kind of rake over an area, soften this all up so it's not so intense, and all that. And by varying that up across the mesh, you can really kind of get some organic feeling strokes. So as we head more towards the center line here, these are going to get softer. And definitely if you're doing skin, this is the method that you want to use to get super realistic pores and things like that on the surface of somebody's nose or all that kind of stuff. This is how you do that. So with the pressure sensitivity of the tablet, you're really able to dial this in and take full control over your mesh here. And you don't always have to go back and smooth. You know, if you want it to be a little less intense, you can just turn down your strength. So 0.1 is still pretty low, but you can go to any sort of decimal value that you want. So even lower than that's possible. And so yeah, there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed tonight. I won't be back this weekend for a live stream in the guild because I'm working on another project tomorrow. But real quick, for anybody who's watching, I want to kind of show you a little bit about the guild. So let me pull this over really quickly. Okay, so this is the orangeguild.com for anybody who's watching that is interested. If you head over to the Orange Guild, you can get signed up for our mailing list right here and get free month membership for the guild straight to your inbox. And if you want to join right now, we're doing a special. It's only $15 a month to join. And if you don't see that box pop up, you can always hit subscribe down here, join there. And we have a lot of training. So I've got 4 Blender courses currently live that go over anything from Blender 2.70 on. So we've got an absolute beginner's course here, subdivision surface modeling, and then 2 courses on how to model a car and texture and shade it in cycles. So if you're interested in more hard surface stuff, this is a cool course to get. All of these are available to watch once you're a member. So you can buy them individually if you want to. But the live stream hangouts and the mentorship is available with the guild membership. And so you just head to here. And if you follow the coupon code at the bottom of the email when you sign up, or it's also in the live stream tonight in the description, you will get your month free. So this will stay free for the first month. And so you can sign up for one of 2 plans here. And I would love to see you guys inside of the guild. So I'll be back next week at 7 p.m. Next week is going to be specially dedicated to beginners. And so Lorian has requested that we talk a little bit more about some intro stuff. So we're going to go through how to build an entire scene and render, do a little bit of animation, and try to quickly blow through all of that, answering questions as we go, Wednesday through Friday next week at 7 p.m. Central Time, USA. So that's going to be a good time. And I'm going to continue to work on the 3D illustration. For any of you who haven't seen that, I'm going to kind of bring this up really quickly and kind of go over what we're doing this month. The concept art for this, if you've seen our social, looks like this. And so the idea was to paint this up and try to recreate this in Blender somehow. So we've been working on all these objects, talking about them in the live streams. If you want to see any of that, you can go back and check those out. Those are all on the YouTube channel. And about 30 hours now of video that you guys can check out where I walk through the whole process of how to create all these objects. And if we look at the latest render, I'll pull this up so you guys can see it. This is kind of where we're at. So the pipe is going to go somewhere around here or here that we're working on tonight. We're about 75% of the way done with this. And so if you're interested in any of that, it is uploaded. And here is sort of a closer up view. So hopefully this will let us move around a little bit. So you can see here how some of these look. I'm actually going to pull this open in Photoshop. Again, I hate Windows image viewer. It's not good. Okay, so this is 100% resolution. So you can see how detailed we're getting with this in cycles. And again, we've been going over image shading and all that sort of stuff with this image. So if you're into that kind of thing, definitely check out the YouTube channel for Brandon Hicks. And I will start uploading tutorials and things like that to the Orange Guild YouTube channel, and that'll all be free as well. So hope you guys have enjoyed tonight. I'll be back next week with more content. And until then, yeah, hang loose. And I'll see you guys next week. So thanks.